Welcome to the WdY&x podcast. Our topic for today is the Living Organization, a path to business transformation by Norman Wolfe. In this episode, we'll discuss how to identify new opportunities for accelerated growth and development and sound executable roadmap that produce short-term results and long-term growth. Stay tuned and we'll show you how to do that. First, I want to introduce Norman. Norman's the founder and CEO of Quantum Leaders. Is a leading voice in bringing about transformation of the core paradigm of business. He is a he has a 15-year veteran of Hewlett Packard, has led companies large and small, been a public company director, and has over 30 years of consulting and mentoring leaders in a wide range of industries. He is the author of The Living Organization, a framework that applies all the core principle of how the world manifests to how world organization individual creates the results. This is a new way of thinking and being that can create extraordinary positive impact to an organization and society. Welcome, Norman.
Thank you, Will. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate you having me on as a guest.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining today. My first question is, can you share a bit about your journey?
Oh, yes, certainly. So as you mentioned, I think a big part of my journey started with Hewlett Packard back in 1973 when I joined them as a systems engineer. My first management job was to become a district service manager, so I did not have sort of technical expertise of the area I was managing. It was also a cultural turnaround, which I didn't know when I took the job. But it quickly led me to learn how to lead organizations and people and challenges. And throughout my career with HP, as I grew up through the organization and evolved my own capabilities, I kept taking on organizations that were in trouble and that I wasn't part of the organization originally. And so I really learned some skills. Then in 1988, I left them and went into consulting. And I've done a lot of consulting in a lot of different industries. I've done marketing, sales, business process improvement. Of course, a lot of it has been leadership development, CEO coaching. Um, and in 2002, I began to really focus on helping organizations be more effective at executing strategy. I'm sure you know the statistics are 70% of companies tend to fail in their attempts at executing their strategy.
Yeah.
Um, and I was talking to the CEO of the board I was on. You mentioned I was on a public company board. He was a former client, and I asked him, "Why do you keep hiring me?" And he said the words, "Norman, you help me execute faster." So that led me into this whole focus, which led me to look at why are we so bad at executing? And that's when I realized we live in a certain paradigm created in the early 1900s where we look at an organization as a machine. And I realized that when I was successful with organizations, I spent a lot of time in what you might call the human dynamics. And as I researched the 30% of companies that were successful, um, they also had a different view of what an organization is. And that's when I began to realize we had to change the paradigm, the core paradigm of business. I wrote the book, The Living Organization, as an attempt to explain how can you how can you change the way you view what is an organization. If it's not a machine, I look at it as a dynamic human social system. So that was the core of the foundation. And ever since I started to write the book, and since it's just been a life path where I am constantly trying to improve and promote that shift in paradigm. I think as a society we need it, and as leaders of organizations we desperately need it.
Thank you for sharing your background. We're going to talk more about the Living Organization. We're going to
Absolutely.
first transition to shout out. Every episode I do dedicate to someone. From my side, I'll dedicate to Ranju Kumari, one of my mentee, been really great agile coach. To Ranju, want to dedicate this episode to you. How about Norman? Who do you want to dedicate this episode to?
There's actually two people I'd like to mention. One is a gentleman, Jim Kemp. He has since passed away, but Jim was a major factor in my success at Hewlett Packard. And the second gentleman, who's also since passed away, is a gentleman named Brew Joy. And Brew was a mentor, spiritual guide, helped me really understand a lot about myself and the human dynamics that I see in people and in organizations.
Thank you for sharing your dedication. Let's go into the topic itself. My very first question is, why are organizations ineffective at achieving their goals and objectives?
Well, I think I began to allude to it when I talked about my journey, but it has to do with the core paradigm of business as we see it. We think of it as a machine, and I use that term. A lot of people are using it, but if you think about the way we approach an organization, especially leaders, we as the leaders are held responsible for figuring out how is this collective of people going to operate. And the goal is to take an input of some kind, resources, whatever, convert it into a valuable output for a customer. And so we think about it as just a machine that takes inputs, produces outputs. I even remember in my early days of management, we used to draw black boxes around. Here's the inputs, here's the outputs, here's the box. What do I do inside of it, right? And we draw process flow diagrams, and of course we try to optimize it and so forth. In my research, I found that the two people responsible for that paradigm, Frederick Taylor, scientific management, as well as Henri Fayol, who designed the hierarchical structure and the specialization concepts, they were both mechanical engineers. So, it's no wonder we think of it as a mechanical unit that we want to optimize. That worked really well to get us started, and it worked pretty good for the first half of the 20th century. But as we got more and more complex, we need more innovation, more creativity, more resilience. These are human attributes. They're not mechanistic attributes. And so I think the problem we're having is we're trying to get a machine to act like a person. That's why I think we fail most of the times. I mean, if you think about it, think about the role of leaders and what they say. They say that, why can't my people contribute more? Why does everything come to me? Can't they see the bigger picture? And so forth. Why don't they, make their contribution? They're the experts in their field. Why are they asking me to solve their problems for them? I kind of correlate that to, well, that's like a parent who did everything for their children as they were growing up, and now the child's living in the basement at the age of 30, and they're going, why is he still in my basement? Right? Well, duh. So, and I don't blame the leaders. I blame the framework or the paradigm we were trained to think about. So it's time to change the paradigm.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Regarding the living organization, how much of your corporate experience have contributed to developing that particular material?
Well, quite a lot of it, actually. I mentioned I always took over poor performing organizations, and I had to learn how to get a collective of people to align to something. And I realized that I was dealing with people, not just machine components.
Hmm.
And so I developed certain skills. I remember somebody, I was doing a training program, and somebody came up to me and said, Norman, you're so good at this, you should be a psychologist. And I said, well, maybe so, but that's not what I learned how to do this stuff, was to become a psychologist. So that was my HP experience. And then, of course, during my over 35 years of consulting with organizations, and sometimes taking over as interim leader of an organization, again, I began to realize that I look at an organization as if it's a living thing. And that's what helped make me successful. That's what I began to get imprinted with. Yes, there's mechanical aspects of it, but that's like a human body. There's mechanical aspects of the human body, my heart rate, my blood flow, but there's also a emotional component, a feeling component, and even a spiritual component to it, a belief systems I have. And that all goes into it. So all those years of experience is what, in I think it was 2004, somebody asked me, what makes you different as a consultant? And I said to them, well, I see an organization as a living being, and with a heart and a soul and a purpose. And she said, you should write a book. And that was the catalyst that got things going to where it is today. So yes, absolutely, everything in my life has done that.
So let's drill down more about the concept, right? Can you describe the model and the four core principle of
Sure.
the living organization?
So when I stepped back and started to look at an organization as a living person, the first thing I had to do was say, okay, the goal of every leader is to create outcomes that make the organization successful. And if an organization is going to be thought of as a person, then I wanted to answer the question, how does a person create outcomes? Because then I would apply that to an organization. And if you think about it, as an individual, as a coach of individuals for years, there's obviously the things we do, right? We have to do stuff to get an outcome. But there's also the nature of my relationship. If I'm in conflict with my wife, for example, and my energy is going to really drop. I'm not going to be able to focus on the doing. I'm going to be distracted. But if I'm feeling really supported and engaged and loved and all of that, I got a lot more energy, and I can apply that to what I'm doing. So the nature and quality of our relationships really have a lot to do with the amount of energy I can apply to the doing. So activity was one element of it because we still want to take care of all of that. Relationship was a second element. We want to have really strong relationships going on, positive, supportive relationship energy. And the third element is what I call context. And this is that domain of everything that causes us to behave the way we do, even though it's unconscious. We call it belief systems, call it the trigger mechanisms we have, how we respond to events. Typically, we don't think about responding, we just respond. That's a good news because it's what makes us efficient in navigating life. But on the other hand, if our response isn't getting us the results, changing the outside world is probably not going to be very effective. Changing the activity is not going to be effective if I don't change the underlying trigger mechanism, so to speak, or the underlying, you might call it the unconscious instruction set. So activity, relationship, and context became the dominant things. And so as I applied it to organizations, as you said, I created four key principles. One, an organization is a living person. So whether you're dealing with a small group of even two people, a team, a department, or a company as a whole, you can actually think of the collective as a single person and then apply these principles to the collective. The second principle is that people / collectives create by the combination of activity, relationship, and context. So we have to take that into account when we do our strategy, when we do our planning, when we're monitoring our progress. We have to look at all three of those elements. Three, since we're living entities, living people, we really are part of an ecosystem. In other words, the statement, no man is an island, is very, very true. We're social beings. And our ecosystem provides resources and also provides limitations. Furthermore, we can look at our organization internally as an ecosystem of living beings working, hopefully, collaboratively together. And when you start to think of it that way, you actually begin to break away the silos and look at it more collaboratively because you recognize you're all, as an ecosystem, you're interdependent. So that's the third principle. And then the fourth principle is kind of a developmental focus. It has to do with the capacity to execute is equal to the capability and the maturity of the individual / collective. So those are the four principles we have as the living organization framework.
Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, sure.
I think part of the book you have is the Wolf's Law. Can you talk
Yeah.
more about the Wolf's Law?
Yeah, I created a little formula. So activity, relationship, and context are, if you think about them as dynamic forces, if you want to look at it from a sort of an engineering perspective, there's a relationship between them, and they're not all the same. They don't all carry the same weight because context uh, has a strong influence on how I enter relationships, and context also has a strong influence on what I think I can do and what I think I can't do. Right,
Mm.
my belief system about what is and isn't possible, and my role in life. All of that affects both my activity and my relationships. And certainly, as I said earlier, my relationships has a strong impact on my activity. So I created a formula, I call it a pseudo formula, that says the impact or output I create is equal to the activity times the relationship squared, both to the power of context.
Oh,
And
wow.
somebody
Okay.
along the line named it Wolf's Law, so it's now become Wolf's Law. But
Thank
it's
you
to
for.
show that your real leverage, if you're a leader, you can spend a lot of time trying to improve processes and you'll get some amount of result. But your real leverage is learning how to manage context
Yep.
and let that flow into changing everything else.
Thank you for sharing the formula. What are the five key skills for a leader at all levels? What are the five key skills?
Okay, so if we're going to learn to deal with context, context has a lot to do with uh, our belief systems, as I mentioned, and who I am as an individual, and again, who I am as a part of the sales department or accounting department has to do with the context. So context and identity are very
Mm.
tied together. So if I'm going to start interacting with somebody about their context, it's not something I can easily observe. I've got to be able to be in conversation with you in a way that allows us to have a very, you might call, deep conversation. And for me, be able to go beyond just what I see, I want to be able to sense and feel things about what's going on around me. Some people call that, situational awareness beyond
Mm.
just the senses. Some people call that intuition or insight. Well, there's a certain set of skills that facilitate that. One is going from the head, which is all logical, to the heart, which is intuitive and sensitive.
Mm.
So, how do you shift from the head to the heart? That's the first skill. Second skill is heart-centered communication. Right. So, how do I apply going from communicating from the heart? Right?
Yep.
Um, Another skill is learning how to reframe context. There's a saying that if you want to achieve different results, but you're doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, that's insanity. If you add to that the fact that what I'm doing is driven by my context, then expecting results just by changing behavior without changing context, it's double insanity. So we
Yes.
have to
Yes.
teach how to change context. And context, in a lot of ways, you can think of as a narrative or stories. People talk about the stories we tell. Um, so the question really is, how do you, one, identify context? So you need heart centering for that. And then two, how do you reframe context? So that has a skill in and of itself. And then how do you help somebody else take on that new context? So that's a whole skill set in itself. Another skill set is what we call improvisation mindset.
Mm.
Um, Again, that has to do with heart centering so you can be aware of what's in the present moment, but then trusting your intuition to respond to it. So you don't necessarily, because we're in a very volatile times, you can't predict what's going to come around the corner. And so you got to be able to improvise very quickly. So we
Yep.
want to teach the improvisation mindset. And the last one we teach, well, not the last one, there's many more, but the fifth core one is what we call balancing polarities or balancing
Mm.
opposites, right? Nothing's black and white, everything lives in gray. So that means there's um, a right side and a left side, and in and an out, centralization or decentralization, individual versus collective. Everything's got polarities to it.
Mm.
And actually, we draw on the work of Barry Johnston's polarity thinking very heavily in this balancing of opposites. So those are the key skill sets we think leaders need to augment and add on to their existing skill sets. None
Thank
of
you
the
for
other stuff
sharing that.
goes away.
There's a lot of concern that organization need to be more ethical, ethically
Uh,
responsible, and moral. What can be done about that?
that's a tough one. And I don't know that I have a clear, um, direct answer. But what I will say is machines cannot be ethical.
Mm.
Machines just do what they're told, right? And so by first shifting the paradigm to understand an organization as a living person, you begin to open the possibility of having conversations around ethics and morality. The second part, I will say that if I look at a organization as being inherently part of an ecosystem, then I have a responsibility to the ecosystem because I'm equally dependent upon the ecosystem. So now we're getting into elements that are necessary to determine what is an ethical response to a situation. Um, of course, it gets much more complicated because now you're into, and especially in our society today, you're into polarization and should companies take a stance in something. I'm not going to engage in that part because, like I said, that's really complicated in today's world. But at least you have a capability of beginning to have the right types of conversations when I look at an organization as a living being, as a person who's a member of a society, which is part of an ecosystem. And now I can ask the question, what's the right choice for our behaviors?
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. We talk a lot about the living organization and how it's important. If there's three takeaway for this episode, what are those three takeaways that we could share with our audience?
Well, I think the first takeaway is please understand we need to shift the paradigm. We can't get to where we want to get to. Uh, I think a better paradigm than the machine is to see the organization inherently as a living person.
Mhm.
And then, of course, I would love them to recognize the four principles of the living organization framework and begin to get curious and wondering how they can begin to apply it to their organizations or to their lives.
Thank you. If you could share with the audience how they could reach out to you if they want to connect with you.
Well, certainly they can reach me at our website, www.quantumleaders.com. And my email address is N as in Norman Wolfe, WOLFE, nwolf@quantumleaders.com. And I'm open to receiving responses from everybody and anybody. I think, offer you the first three chapters of my book are available on quantumleaders.com/podcast. And your audience is welcome to download that at any time.
Thank you very much, Norman. I'll add that to the podcast when I release the
Mhm.
episode. I really appreciate your time, Norman. Thank you very much for being our guest today and really appreciate your time and thank you.
You're very welcome, Will, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share about my work and my life.
You're welcome.